afternoon. Welcome. This is the 9th annual Left Forum and our first ever Saturday matinee with Noam Chomsky. My name is Jamie McCallum. I'm on the board of directors of Left Forum, and it's great. It's great to be here with all of you and with Noam, of course. I just have a few short announcements before we begin. For those of you who are new to the forum, your program guide that you receive at registration is your conference Bible. Please cherish it, keep it close to you, and check it often. All kinds of logistical information, panel information, where food is or is not, things like that. So that's important. In that program guide is also a short one-page addendum with all information that didn't make the program guide. Either it was too late or mistakenly left off, so that is really important. Tons of volunteers spent hours and hours and hours producing it, so it's important that that we try to make use of it. And lastly, I want to thank some of the independent media outlets that are helping to document our event this weekend. We have folks here from Pacifica Network, WBAI, Sirius Radios, Make It Plain, Deep Dish TV, Free Speech TV, CPR Metro, and many, many others. So thanks for those folks. This is the last place that I'll ever have to, that I really should be introducing Noam Chomsky because so many of you are familiar with him, both as a scholar, a critic, and an activist. As I have, many of you have followed not only his sort of broad contours of his career, but also his voice, his inspiration. And in fact, if you're also like me, it's part of that voice, part of his inspiration that has also helped you probably find your own as scholars and critics and as activists. In 2010, Noam gave a keynote address here at our closing plenary, where he spoke very closely to that year's theme. And this year, when we thought of this idea, mobilizing for economic and ecologic transformation, his name immediately came to mind. As I was just relaying this to him backstage, I said, it was so great that you paid such close attention to our theme that year. We really appreciate that. And he says, well, what is it this year? So I told him, and he said, great, well, that'll work perfectly. We thought of him for a whole slew of general reasons, but also for his knowledge on these particular topics, and also for his political compass. Always the kind of person that can help us figure out what to do at the tough moments, times of great uncertainty, deep crisis, and certainly times much like today. So please join me in a big New York City welcome for Mr. Noam Chomsky.
Secret information, but nothing's secret anymore. Obama knows about it before we do. Well, I'd like to say a couple of things about tendencies in American society, what they portend for us and for the world in the light of U.S. power. It's diminishing as it has been since 1945, but it's still incomparable, and it's dangerous. Obama's remarkable global terror campaign and the pathetic reaction to it here are only one example. I'll come to much more serious ones. Well, there is a kind of received doctrine about American society. We're supposed to be living in a capitalist democracy, which is the best possible system, despite some flaws. There have been interesting debates over the years as to the relation between capitalism and democracy, in fact, whether they're even compatible. I won't be pursuing that, because I'd like to keep to a different system, what we can call a really existing capitalist democracy. RECD for short, pronounced wrecked. So to begin with, how does wrecked compare with democracy? Well, there's, depends what we mean by democracy, of course. There are several versions. There's, again, a received doctrine that's soaring rhetoric of President Obama, 4th of July speeches, which are taught in an 8th grade civics class. It's government of, by, and for the people. And it's easy to compare that with wrecked. One of the main topics studied in professional political science is the relation between attitudes and policy. We have a lot of information about attitudes, very heavily polled country and policy, you can see. And the results are interesting. The best studies basically show that for about 70% of the population, the lowest 70% on the wealth-income scale, their opinions have no influence on policy. They're effectively disenfranchised. As you move up the scale, you get a little more influence. By the time you get to the top, which these days is maybe 1/10%, you have basically you get what you want. So the proper term for that is plutocracy, or maybe to take Jim Hightower's phrase, radical kleptocracy. Inquiries into the relation between public opinion and policy are kind of dangerous stuff, as this illustrates. So you can see why Congress has just banned funding for them. So maybe we won't have to hear them anymore. This shows up clearly all the time. So the major domestic, just say the major domestic issue, there's a split between the population and a tiny sector who essentially run things. For the population, polls are very clear. The main problem is jobs. For the wealthy and corporate sector and the banks, the main problem is the deficit. So what do we have as policy? Well, the deficit. The sequester is not about jobs, it's about the deficit. The same is true on a very wide range of issues. So, for example, one takes a minimum wage. There are two views. One is that it should be indexed to the cost of living and should be high enough to prevent falling below the poverty line. That's about 80% of the public. Among the decision makers, the rich and the powerful, it's about half that, 40%. Same with unions, same with laws that encourage union activity, same on the public option for health care. For 35 years, as long as polls have been taken, large majorities have held that corporations and the wealthy should pay higher taxes. Well, on and on. Policy throughout is virtually the opposite of public opinion. And that's a typical property of wrecked. Back in the 1950s, somebody, I think it may have been C. Wright Mills, described the United States as a one-party state, the business party with two factions, the Democrats and Republicans. Now, that's no longer true. It's still a one-party state with the business party, but there's only one faction. It's moderate Republicans who now call themselves Democrats. There is something called the Republican Party, but long ago it abandoned any pretense of being a normal parliamentary party in the sense of Western societies. It's in lockstep service to the rich and the corporate sector as a catechism that everyone has to repeat. It raises a problem. How do you get votes? You can't get votes that way because it's totally opposed by the majority, large majority of the public. So they've been compelled to mobilize sectors of the population that have always been there, but not as the base of a political party before. So religious extremists, plenty of them in the United States, who was off the spectrum, and religious extremism, nativists who are terrified that they are going to take over our country, maybe attack us under the UN flag. So we have to have guns to protect ourselves. This is not a joke, incidentally. Or maybe to protect ourselves against Obamacare, or maybe against the Sharia law that Obama is planning to impose, not just on the United States, but on the whole world. That's actually half of registered Republicans. And others like them. That's the base. And you saw it in an interesting way in the Republican primaries. Every time a candidate came out from the base, there was terror in the Republican establishment because it was so lunatic. And they had to pour money in, tons of money, so they started pouring in for attack ads to knock them down so that the establishment could finally get their Wall Street guy. This is not a joke. It has serious consequences. And it's worth remembering that it results very naturally from the shifts in the economy and the political system of the past generation basically of a corporate bipartisan neoliberal assault on the population. So in brief, Recht is very remote from the soaring rhetoric about democracy. But there's another version of democracy. It's the standard, it's also a standard doctrine, but of a different group. It's the standard doctrine of progressive contemporary democratic theory. So I'll give you some illustrative quotes. This is from the kind of left end of the mainstream spectrum. Quotes, the public are ignorant and meddlesome outsiders. They have to be put in their place. Decisions must be in the hands of an intelligent minority of responsible men. They have to be protected from the trampling and the roar of the bewildered herd. The herd has what's called a function. It's to show up every couple of years and lend their weight between a choice among the responsible men. But apart from that, their function is to be spectators, not participants. And that's for their own good, because we should not succumb to democratic dogmatisms about people being the best judges of their own interests. They're not. We are. And therefore, they should be kept as spectators. Their attitudes and opinions must be controlled. It's necessary to regiment their minds the way an army regiments its bodies. It's necessary to discipline the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young, churches, schools, universities. And maybe if we do all this, we can get back to the good old days, quoting now, when Truman had been able to govern the country with the cooperation of a relatively small number of Wall Street lawyers and bankers. Well, many of you ought to be able to recognize the sources of the quotes from icons of the liberal establishment, leading progressive democratic theorists. So that's another version of democracy. Actually, the roots of that version go back to 17th century England, the first democratic revolution, 1640s, the civil war between king and parliament. And the gentry, the men of best quality, as they called themselves, they were appalled by rising popular forces who were saying that they didn't want to be governed by either king or parliament. I'm quoting now. They didn't want to be ruled by knights and gentlemen who do but oppress us, but governed by countrymen like ourselves who know the people's sores. But that was coming from the rabble, and it was a terrifying sight. And major efforts were made and at that time carried out to crush them. The same was true a century later. Founding fathers of the American Republic, same picture. Now you look back at the Constitutional Convention, they determined, I'll quote, that power must be in the hands of the wealth of the nation, those who have sympathy for property owners and their rights, and who understand that a fundamental task of government is to protect the minority of the opulent from the majority. Now, that's James Madison in the Constitutional Convention. It's not what you read in the Federalist Papers, it's what you read in school. That was mostly propaganda, trying to get a recalcitrant population to accept the constitutional structure. The constitutional system was actually constructed on that basis, very explicitly adhering to the principle that was enunciated by the President of the Constitutional Convention, first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Jay, which is that those who own the country ought to govern it. Now, there have been a lot of popular struggles since that time. They've won many victories, but the masters don't relent. They keep to the same positions that the gentry had in the 17th century. The more freedom is won, the more intense are the efforts to redirect the society to a proper course. 20th century progressive democratic theory, the kind that I just sampled, is basically that of the men of best quality of the 17th century, the founders of the American Republic, and not very different from the rect that has been achieved, apart from one question of who are the responsible men, who should rule. Should it be bankers or intellectual elites? Or for that matter, should it be the Central Committee in another version of essentially the same doctrines? Well, there's another important feature of rect, and that is that the public has to be kept in the dark about what's happening to them. That's crucial. The herd has to remain bewildered. And there are reasons for that. They were explained lucidly by the professor of the science of government at Harvard. There is such a chair, Samuel Huntington. He pointed, he's a pretty honest guy. He said that power remains strong when it remains in the dark. Exposed to sunlight, it begins to evaporate. That's on the front pages right now. Bradley Manning, for example, is facing a life in prison for failure to comprehend this scientific principle, which is taught at Harvard. And it works pretty well. The polls illustrate it quite interestingly. The polls show that the Republicans are preferred to the Democrats on most issues, including the crucial issues on which the public opposes their policies. One striking case is that considerable majorities say that they favor the Republicans on tax policy, but the same majorities oppose those policies. Now, that's even true of the far right Tea Party people. Results like those, which are pretty consistent, illustrate demoralization of the public in a kind that's unusual, though there are examples, not attractive ones. The late Weimar Republic comes to mind. Well, the task of ensuring that the rabble keep to their function as bewildered spectators may take many forms. One simple means is simply to restrict entry into the political system. Iran's having an election right now, and it's rightly criticized because candidates have to be vetted by the Guardian Council of Clerics. Here, we don't have that. Here, they're vetted by concentrations of private capital. Mechanisms are too familiar to review, so I'll leave it aside. But that's not safe enough either. There are huge institutions in the United States developed over the past century dedicated to undermining a received version of democracy in the 8th grade civics class version. It's called the public relations industry. They run elections, and the goal of the electoral campaigns run by the PR industry is to create uninformed voters who make irrational decisions, like the kind I just illustrated in polls. And they know what they're doing. So, for example, as you may recall, after Obama's election in 2008, a couple of months later, the advertising industry had its annual convention. Every year they give an award for the best marketing campaign of the year. And that year they gave it to Obama. He beat out Apple Computer. He was able to delude the public better than Apple would. And there were interesting reports about it in the business press, Financial Times in London, quoting executives who are just euphoric. They have a new style they can follow. They used to have Reagan style, now they can follow the Obama style. Great way of undermining democracy. And it's a pretty easy transition for the public relations industry from their major goal, their major commitment, which is to undermine markets. Markets, if you took an economics course, are supposed to be based on informed consumers making rational choices. You get kind of nice theorems. But anyone who's looked at a television ad knows that the purpose is to create uninformed consumers who will make irrational choices. That's the main task of commercial advertising. When it turns to running elections, it undermines democracy the same way. Well, the core of the economy today is financial institutions. It's vast expansion since the 1970s with financialization of the economy and the accelerated shift of production abroad, and very rapid changes in the character of financial institutions. So those of you who are old enough will remember that a bank used to be a place where you put in a little extra money and lend it to somebody to buy a car or something like that. Those days are gone. The financial institutions are totally different in what they do, and they're huge. They had 40% of corporate profits in 2007, right on the eve of the financial crisis for which they were largely responsible. Well, it's interesting that after the crisis, around 2008, 2009, a number of leading economists, among them Robert Solow, a Nobel laureate from MIT, and Ben Friedman of Harvard, a couple of others, began to look into what the impact is of the financial institutions on the economy. It's kind of an interesting gap considering their scale. Well, Solow and Friedman both pointed out that economists hadn't done much study of the impact of financial institutions. And both of them thought that it's probably negative, their harm to the economy. Now, there are some who are much more outspoken. So the most respected financial correspondent in the English-speaking world, Mark Wolf of the London Financial Times, he says that the out-of-control financial sector is eating out the market economy from inside, just as the larva of a spider wasp eats out the host in which it has been laid. By the market economy means the productive economy. I'll get back to what it actually is. There's a recent issue of one of the main business journals, Bloomberg Business Week, which reviews an IMF study that just came out, which concluded that the biggest banks make no profit. What they earn traces to the government insurance policy. There's a widely publicized bailout, but that's the least of it. It goes way beyond that. Now, the editors of the journal say that this is crucial to understanding why the big banks present such a threat to the global economy and to the people of the country, of course. After the crash, the first serious attention took place in the economics profession to what's called systemic risk. The risk that when you make a transaction, it'll have effects elsewhere, like maybe bringing down the whole system. It's called systemic risk. It's called an externality. It's a footnote in economics texts, one of the flaws of market systems. Externality is pretty big, and there are much more serious ones than this. Well, there is an effort to put some limits on the larva that's eating out the economy, and incidentally preparing the way for the next crash, as it's very definitely doing. The Dodd-Frank bill, as you've probably been reading, Congress is being besieged by huge armies of corporate lobbyists who are making sure that the bill is defanged. It won't have any effect. There's also things like the spectacle, comical in a way, I guess, of the chief executive of Apple testifying before the Senate recently about how they managed to avoid paying taxes, even the senators eating out of his hand. It's kind of interesting to watch. Because what he pointed out to them, which is correct, is that Apple was just following the laws that they wrote. He didn't point out that the laws that they wrote were written by lobbyists for Apple and other corporations. But it's a very extreme case of what's sometimes called regulatory capture, you know, that industries take control of the regulatory apparatus that's supposed to regulate them, in this case, Congress. It's so comical that the New York Times business correspondent wrote that maybe corporate taxes should just be kissed goodbye. There's no way to get corporations to pay them, so let's forget the whole farce. Actually, that's not necessarily the case. There are interesting proposals as to how to get around it, very simple ones. One goes back to E.F. Schumacher, who was revived recently by economist Dean Baker. Now, that is that companies should give non-voting stock to the government. But that's effectively a corporate tax that can't be evaded, and a very simple way to ensure it. But unfortunately, under RECT, that's about as likely to be enacted as a financial transactions tax that would eliminate the larva that's eating away at the economy and direct investment to productive purposes and, of course, bring in a ton of revenue. Well, what about the productive economy, what's called the market economy in the standard mantra? The standard story is that the productive economy is based on entrepreneurial initiative and consumer choice in a free market. In reality, it's based on massive state intervention. One of the most striking examples is the IT revolution, which is like core of the growing sector of the economy. That was based on information technology. The hard and the costly work was substantially in the state sector for decades. Places like my university, for example, the lab where I was working for decades. Zero consumer choice. There was some entrepreneurial initiative, but mostly limited to how to get government grants and how to get bailouts, tons of bailouts, and also to ensure procurement. Procurement is one of the major ways, often ignored, to ensure corporate profit. Like you get the government to buy, which can't sell computers that are too expensive. They go to Los Alamos, that kind of thing. Well, it's not quite that simple, but that's actually the core part of the picture of the productive economy. The system goes way back, but dramatically true since World War II. Well, another crucial aspect of RECT is sharp concentration of capital. Development of oligopoly also undermines any kind of markets. In just the last 20 years, the share of profits of the 200 largest enterprises have risen very sharply. These developments also undermine the mantra. It's an interesting topic. I won't pursue it. Instead of going on with this, I'd like to turn to something else. How does the future fare under RECT? And the answer is pretty grim. It's no secret that there are a number of dark shadows that hover over every topic we discuss. There are two that are particularly ominous. One is environmental catastrophe, and the other is nuclear war, both of which are very serious and indeed growing threats to decent survival. Well, I'm not going to say much about environmental catastrophe. I think you all know about it. The scale of the danger is obvious to anyone with eyes open, and particularly people who read the scientific literature. Each issue of a major scientific journal has more dire warnings than the last one. There are various reactions to this. It's not a secret. At one extreme, there are some who are trying to act decisively, if possible, to prevent a possible catastrophe. At the other extreme, there are major efforts underway to accelerate the threats, to march off the cliff as quickly as possible, like the proverbial lemons. Well, leading the effort to intensify the likely disaster is the richest and most powerful country in world history, with incomparable advantages, and the most prominent example of wrecked. Leading the effort to preserve conditions in which our immediate descendants might have a decent life are the so-called primitive societies, First Nations, Aboriginal, tribal, and so on. And the scale is pretty remarkable. So last year, for example, there were over 1,000 actions recorded by indigenous people, efforts to defend the earth, as they put it. The countries with large and influential indigenous populations are well in the lead in seeking to defend the earth. The countries that have driven indigenous populations to virtual extinction or extreme marginalization are racing enthusiastically towards destruction. So, for example, Ecuador, which is an oil producer and has a large indigenous population, is seeking to get aid from the rich countries, which it won't get, to keep its substantial oil reserves in the ground, which is where they ought to be. Meanwhile, the US and Canada, super rich, are enthusiastically seeking to burn every drop of fossil fuels, including the extremely dangerous Canadian tar sands, and to do it as quickly and as fully as possible, while they hail the wonders of a largely meaningless energy independence. A century of energy independence means nothing, without a side glance at what the world might look like after this extravagant commitment to self-destruction. Every issue of the daily papers illustrates it amply, illustrates this lunacy, and that's the right word for it. All is exactly the opposite of what elementary rationality would demand, except for the skewed form of rationality that flows naturally from wrecked. Well, there are massive corporate campaigns to try to safeguard the lunacy, but they haven't been enough. It turns out that there's a real problem in American society. The public is still too committed to scientific rationality. One of the many divergences between opinion and policy is that the American public is quite close to the international norm in concern about the environment and in calling for serious measures to prevent catastrophe. Meanwhile, bipartisan policy is dedicated to bringing it on, in George W. Bush's famous phrase. Well, fortunately, the solution to this is a corporate-funded organization that you know about, ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council, and they're riding to the rescue. As you know, ALEC designs legislation for states. There's no need to comment on what kind of legislation. And they're now instituting an educational program for states. It's a program to overcome the excessive rationality of the public. It's a K-12 program which is, according to its propaganda, to improve critical faculties by balanced teaching. Balanced teaching means that if a sixth grade class is learning something about the climate, that has to be balanced by teaching them about climate change denial. Improve their critical faculties. Maybe it's hoped that that'll overcome the failure of the massive corporate propaganda campaign to make the population ignorant and irrational enough to safeguard a short-term profit for the rich. We have to remember that these are deep-seated institutional properties of RECT. They're built into the institutions, not easy to uproot. And all of this is quite apart from the institutional necessity to maximize short-term profit while ignoring an externality that's vastly more serious even than systemic risk, which just brings down the financial system periodically. For that market failure, the culprits can go cap in hand to the taxpayer, who can restore their wealth and power. That's what we're seeing right now. But in the case of the destruction of the conditions for decent existence, there's no guardian angel around who can bail you out. And for this reason alone, the prospects for decent survival under Recht are quite dim. Well, let's turn to the other dark shadow, nuclear war. It's a threat that's been with us for 70 years. Still is. In some ways it's growing. One fundamental reason for this is that under Recht, the rights and the needs of the general population are a minor matter, and that extends to security. There's another prevailing doctrine, in particular in the academic professions. Those of you who know about, say, international relations theory are familiar with this. The doctrine is that governments seek to protect national security. It's mostly myth. They seek to extend power and domination of their core constituency, wherever the domestic concentration of power is, U.S. corporate sector. And the consequence is that systematically, security just does not have a high priority. We see that all the time, right now, in fact. So take, say, Obama's operation to murder Osama bin Laden, prime suspect for the 9/11 attack. He just gave a big speech on May 23rd, plenty of publicity on national security. It's supposed to be a major speech. There's one passage in it that seems to have been ignored, but it's important. Obama hailed the operation, pride and credit for it, but he added that it cannot be the norm, and I'll quote his reasons. The reasons are that the risks were immense. The SEALs might have been embroiled in an extended firefight, but even though with luck that didn't happen, the cost to our relationship with Pakistan and the backlash among the Pakistani public over the encroachment on their territory was so severe that we are just now beginning to rebuild this important partnership. One example was this morning. Yesterday, the new president announced loudly that can't have any more drone attacks in Pakistan. This morning, there was another one on the village somewhere. That's how we improve our partnership. Also create plenty of terrorists. Every one of them is a terrorist-generating device. Well, let's add a couple of details that Obama didn't mention. The SEALs were ordered to fight their way out if they were apprehended. If they had been, they wouldn't have been left to their fate if they'd been, in Obama's words, embroiled in an extended firefight. The full force of the U.S. military would have been used to extricate them. Pakistan has a powerful military, well-trained, highly protective of state sovereignty, also, of course, has nuclear weapons, thanks in large part to Ronald Reagan. And leading Pakistani specialists are quite concerned by the exposure of these systems to jihadi elements. This could have escalated to nuclear war. In fact, it came pretty close. While the SEALs were still in bin Laden's compound, the Pakistani chief of staff, Kayani, was informed of the invasion, and he ordered his staff to confront any unidentified aircraft. He assumed they're probably coming from India. And meanwhile, in Kabul, General Petraeus, head of the Central Command, ordered U.S. warplanes to respond if the Pakistanis scrambled their fighter jets. Well, as Obama said, by luck it didn't happen. But the risk was faced, and strikingly, without concern. Very significant fact. There's a lot more to say about that particular operation and its immense cost to Pakistan, but instead, let's take a look more closely at the concern for security by state authorities, keeping the security from instant destruction by nuclear weapons. I'll put aside the radical lack of concern for terrorism. I mean, it's kind of surreal to listen to Obama today say we have to take everyone's phone calls because we want to protect you from terrorism. Meanwhile, they're doing everything they can to increase terrorism from the highest level that's familiar, that the global terror campaign, the drone campaign, is just generating potential terrorists, obviously. I mean, and it is, drones, remember, are terror weapons. And they're designed that way. I mean, if you don't know whether 5 minutes from now the guy across the street is going to be blown away by somebody thousands of miles away, with everybody who happens to be around him, you're terrorized. And whole regions are terrorized this way. And it has consequences. And people don't like it. And they react. And you get people we call terrorists. So it's a terror-generating campaign, and it's not the only case. The invasion of Iraq is a striking case. U.S. and British intelligence warned the governments that the invasion of Iraq was likely to increase terror. Well, they didn't care. I mentioned in the memoirs. And in fact, it did. Terror increased by a factor of 7 in the first year after the invasion. It's a big increase. That's from Rand Corporation, quasi-government statistics. But it's just not an issue. But let's turn to the more serious case. Destruction, instant destruction by nuclear weapons. What about that? Well, it turns out that's never been a concern for state authorities. And there are many striking examples. I'll give you a few. Take, say, around 1950. The U.S. was in a position of extraordinary security. Half the world's wealth controlled the hemisphere of both oceans, opposite sides of both oceans. Other powers were devastated or destroyed. Incredible security. There was one potential threat, ICBMs with hydrogen bomb warheads. The Russians knew that they were way behind in technology, contrary to a lot of propaganda. And they offered the United States a treaty to ban ICBMs with nuclear warheads. But that would have been a tremendous step forward for the security of Americans. There's a history of nuclear weapons, kind of a standard history by McGeorge Bundy. He was National Security Advisor for Kennedy and Johnson. He had access to high-level documents. And he kind of mentions this in passing. And he says he wasn't even able to find a staff paper that even considered it. Granted, it was considered and rejected. Nobody considered it. Who cares? So we'll get wiped out by ICBMs. Let's go on to the next topic. In 1952, Stalin made a pretty remarkable offer. He offered to the public to allow Germany to be reunified with democratic elections under international supervision, which the West was sure to win, but on condition that it be demilitarized. Take a look at Russian history. Germany alone had practically wiped out Russia several times in the past half-century, and as part of a Western hostile military alliance, it was a tremendous threat. Well, that was public, so it was mentioned. And there were some people who said it should be taken seriously, like James Warburg, influential commentator. But it was just ridicule. It was dismissed with ridicule. Well, by now, Russian archives are coming out. And it turns out that it was apparently serious. And now scholarship, even right-wing scholarship, is beginning to take it seriously. Well, if it had been taken seriously at the time and was real, which it might have been, could have led to a sharp reduction in the threat of war and, of course, also undercut the official reason for NATO. In the late 1950s, Khrushchev came in. He knew the Russians were way behind. He offered the United States a deal, sharp cutback in offensive weapons, mutual cutback in offensive weapons, so that Russia could use its much more limited resources for economic development. The Eisenhower administration didn't pay much attention. Kennedy administration did. They paid attention and decided to reject it in favor of an increase in offensive weapons, sharp increase. In fact, Khrushchev went ahead and actually unilaterally carried out the reduction, but that just led to a sharper increase under the Kennedy administration. Well, you don't have to talk about that. In fact, that's one reason why Khrushchev placed missiles in Cuba in 1962, to try to balance the huge American advantage. There was another reason. Kennedy, as you probably know, was carrying out a massive terror campaign against Cuba, Operation Mongoose, huge terrorist campaign. And it was scheduled to lead to an invasion, a U.S. invasion in October 1962. Well, the Russians and the Cubans presumably knew about that. It was in October 1962 that the missiles were put in. And that led to what is called the most dangerous moment in history by historian Arthur Schlesinger, Kennedy's advisor. Then followed extremely tense weeks. They culminated on October 26th, 1962. At that time, B-52s armed with nuclear weapons were ready to attack Moscow. The cruise command system was such that crews could have proceeded without central command, just by the crew's decision. Kennedy himself was leaning towards military action to remove the missiles from Cuba. His subjective estimate at the time was that the probability of nuclear war was maybe a third to a half. At that point, a letter came from Khrushchev to Kennedy, a private letter, with a proposal to end the crisis. End the crisis by mutual withdrawal, of public withdrawal of Russian missiles from Cuba and U.S. missiles from Turkey. Well, actually, Kennedy hadn't even known that there were missiles from Turkey. And in fact, at that time, they were being withdrawn because they were obsolete. They were being replaced by invulnerable Polaris submarines. So the offer is, we'll withdraw the missiles from Cuba, you withdraw the missiles that you're already withdrawing from Turkey, withdrawing because they're obsolete, you're a bigger threat, and it'll be public and it'll all be over. No more dangerous moment in history. Well, Kennedy refused. In my view, that's probably the most horrendous decision in human history. He was willing to take a huge risk of destroying the world to establish a principle. The principle is that we have a right to threaten anyone with destruction any way we like, but it's a unilateral right. And no one else can threaten us, even to deter a planned invasion. And worse still is the lesson that's been drawn from this. Kennedy is praised for his cool courage under pressure. Well, the threats continued. 10 years later, in 1973, Kissinger called a nuclear alert. This was in the middle of the end of the Arab-Israeli war. The reason that he called the nuclear alert was that the U.S. and Russia had made a deal to impose a ceasefire to end the fighting. But Kissinger had privately informed Israel that they could ignore the ceasefire. And the nuclear alert was to tell the Russians, keep out. This is the way we're playing the game. Didn't lead to war. 10 years later, Ronald Reagan came in. His administration decided to probe Russian defenses by simulating air and naval attacks, also placing Pershing missiles in Germany, which had a 5-minute flight time to Russian targets, provided what the CIA called a super sudden first strike capability. Well, not surprisingly, this caused a lot of alarm in Russia, which, unlike the United States, is quite vulnerable and had repeatedly been invaded and virtually destroyed. That led to a major war scare in 1983. Current issue, it's only recently been discovered how serious it was. The current issue of the journal Strategic Studies says it almost became a prelude to a Russian preventative nuclear strike, in which case we wouldn't be talking here. There are newly released archives which reveal that the danger was much more severe than historians had assumed. There's a current CIA study. It's called "The War Scare Was for Real." It concludes that U.S. intelligence underestimated the threat of a Russian preventative nuclear strike. They took it seriously when it looked as if the U.S. was invading their country, surprisingly. And it continues. I won't run through the record, but the most recent case is the bin Laden assassination, and there are more waiting. And 3 of them are on the front pages right now, so let's take a brief look at those. North Korea, Iran, and China. So take North Korea. It's issuing, government's issuing wild, dangerous threats attributed here to the lunacy of the leaders. Could be the worst government in the world, make a case for that. But if we want to reduce the threats, instead of to march blindly in unison, there are a couple of things to consider. The current crisis began with U.S.-South Korean war games right on the border of North Korea. For the first time ever, quote the official description, they included simulation of preemptive attack in an all-out war scenario against North Korea. They also led to simulated nuclear bombing on North Korea's borders by B-52s and B-2s, most sophisticated machines of destruction in the world. Well, you know, that brings up some memories for the North Korean leadership. For example, they can remember that there was a superpower that virtually leveled the entire country 60 years ago. And when there was nothing left to bomb, because it was all flat, the U.S. turned to bombing dams. It's a war crime for which people were hanged at Nuremberg. And even if we choose not to look, they probably read the documents. For example, the official Air Force records, which are exult at the time. Just, you should read them. They exult over the glorious sight of massive floods, quote, that scooped clear 27 miles of valley below. It devastated 75% of the controlled water supply for North Korea's rice production, sending the commissars scurrying to the press and radio centers to blare to the world the most severe, hate-filled harangues to come from the communist propaganda mill in the 3 years of the war. To the communists, the smashing of the dams meant primarily the destruction of their chief sustenance, rice. Westerners can little conceive the awesome meaning which the loss of this staple food supply has for the Asians, starvation and slow death. Hence the show of rage, the flare of violent tempers, and the threat of reprisals when bombs fell on 5 irrigation dams. That's the lunatic gooks. Well, it's worth reading in full. This is the official Air Force record. Like other potential targets that crazed North Korean leaders, you can also read high-level documents that outline U.S. strategic doctrine. One of the most important is a study by the Clinton years by STRATCOM, Strategic Command, which is in charge of nuclear strategy and controlling nuclear weapons. It's called Essentials of Cold War Deterrence. It's about the role of nuclear weapons in the post-Cold War era. And its central conclusions are, read them, the U.S. must maintain right of first strike, even against non-nuclear states. Furthermore, nuclear weapons must always be available because they cast a shadow over any crisis or conflict, meaning they're constantly used, just as you're using a gun even if you don't fire it, if you go in to rob a store and aim it at the store owner. That's a point that Dan Ellsberg's been trying to make for many years. STRATCOM goes on to say that planners should not be too rational about determining what the opponent values the most, all of which must be targeted. It hurts to portray ourselves as too fully rational and cool-headed, that the U.S. may become irrational and vindictive if its vital interests are attacked, should be part of the national persona we project. It's beneficial for our strategic posture if some elements may appear to be out of control. Well, there's also a recent history that the North Korean leaders know very well. I won't review it because it's too late. But it's quite interesting and it's revealing. I'll summarize. I'll quote a mainstream scholarly summary. North Korea has been playing tit for tat, reciprocating whenever Washington cooperates, retaliating whenever Washington reneges. It's doubtless a horrible place, but the record suggests directions that could be taken to reduce the threat of war, if that were the intention. It's certainly not military maneuvers and simulated nuclear bombing. Well, let's turn to what's called the gravest threat to peace. That's Obama's words, repeated dutifully in the press. Iran's nuclear program. A couple of questions arise to any rational mind out of the right sense of rationality. So one question is, who thinks it's a threat? The second is, what is the threat? The third, what can we do about it? So who thinks it's a threat? Answer is very simple. It's a Western obsession, primarily the United States. The non-aligned countries don't think so. The Arab countries don't, the Arab populations don't think so. The dictators may, but not the populations. They don't like Iran, but don't regard it as a threat. It's the United States and a couple of its allies. Why is it a threat? Well, we know the answer from the highest level sources, the Pentagon and the intelligence community. They present regular analyses of the global security situation to Congress, and they, of course, talk about the Iranian threat. What they point out is that Iran poses no military threat, has no limited capacity to deploy force, and if they're developing nuclear weapons, which we don't know, that would be part of their deterrent strategy. Well, that's a threat. The U.S. cannot tolerate a deterrent. No rogue power can accept a deterrent. You have to be free to threaten or use force whenever you like under doctrines of the kind I quoted. So deterrents are a real threat. Well, it leads to the third question. What can you do about the threat, whatever you think it is? There are a number of possibilities. I'll just keep to one, the most interesting one. One straightforward possibility is to move to establish a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region. Overwhelming international support. It's, for years, it's been pressed in the international arena, primarily by the Arab states, Egypt in the lead, but non-aligned countries urge it, and almost everyone does. So what can you do? Well, a lot of things. For example, last December, there was a great way to move forward. There was an international conference planned in Helsinki to carry forward efforts to try to create a nuclear weapons-free zone. Big question. Israel said they wouldn't attend. Okay, that was expected. Your question is, what will Iran do? In early November, Iran announced that they would attend. A couple of days later, Obama canceled the conference. And what does that mean? Well, the European Parliament passed a resolution calling for it to resume. The Arab states called on it to resume. It was actually an NGO conference, but it doesn't mean anything. If the United States blocks it, it can't happen. Well, what happens then? Possibly march on to war. It's a very dangerous war, which could easily get out of hand. And that's forecast. Shortly after the Helsinki conference was banned by Obama, there was another conference. It was run by the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. It's an APAC offshoot that the press pretends is a neutral agency. It's one of the main sources of information. It was an important conference. It was attended by Dennis Ross, Elliot Abrams, and other, quoting, former top advisors to Obama and Bush. I'm quoting from the Israeli press. I didn't see a report here. They assured the audience, I'm quoting, that the president will strike Iran in 2013 if diplomacy doesn't succeed. That was a pretty upbeat conference. got it, in other words. Well, of course, diplomacy can't succeed if the options are blocked. And crucially, the population here can't be organized to fend off the threat of war because they don't know anything about this. And that's taken care of very easily. There hasn't been one word about this anywhere in the free press. That's discipline for you. Not coming from the government, you know, not coming by command. It's just understood. There's some things you don't say, like these. Well, let's take the last of the potential confrontations, China. Chinese too have memories, even recent ones. Like they have memories from 1962, the most dangerous moment in history. 6 months before the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy sent nuclear-armed missiles to Okinawa, aimed at China, at a very tense moment then in the China conflict, if you remember. Well, that sort of passed without comment here. As I said, we have the right to threaten anyone with nuclear destruction anytime. So we'll skip that. But the Chinese don't necessarily skip it. And they can look at what's going on right around them. So it's called a pivot to Asia. So new, upgraded military bases in Northwest Australia, Vietnam, Philippines, South Korea, Jeju Island. And then there's Japan and the US Pacific Islands. You should take a look at a map. These form what China can't help but see as a threatening arc of military power, surrounds them and surrounds the waters that are crucial for their commerce. As far as I know, no Chinese bases have yet been discovered surrounding the United States, or in fact anywhere. It's kind of striking to see how this confrontation is formulated here. We learn a lot about the doctrinal character of Recht from that. So for example, last month the New York Times had an article on China's military buildup. They said it was quite ominous. It's a tiny fraction of ours. This quote, it was a serious challenge to the United States in the waters around China. Okay? Not in the Caribbean, not the waters off California, where of course it wouldn't be tolerated for a moment. If you turn to the strategic analysis literature, sober analysts, they describe the US-China confrontation as what they call a classic security dilemma, in which each side sees fundamental interests at stake over control of the waters around China. The US regards its policy of controlling these waters as defensive, while China regards them as threatening. Similarly, China isn't happy when the US sends the nuclear aircraft carrier George Washington to waters that place Beijing within the range of its nuclear missiles. You can imagine the reaction if China did anything remotely like that. Well, this classic security dilemma, again, makes sense on the assumption that the US has a right to control the world, and that US security, whatever that means, requires something approaching total global control. Phrase for that from George Bush #1, what we say goes, and the world better understanding. Let me end by suggesting that you think about all of this in a broader historical perspective. It's useful. We'll soon be commemorating the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta.